Today at the National Press Club, Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. A week on from the Albanese government's first budget, soaring inflation remains the big challenge facing the Australian economy and households. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor delivers today's post-budget reply National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra today for our Westpac address. My name's David Crowe. I'm the Chief Political Correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and also a Director here at the club. Our guest today is the Shadow Treasurer of Australia, Angus Taylor, with his post-budget reply address to the National Press Club, and that's a big part of our series of addresses before and after every budget. We heard last week from Treasurer Jim Chalmers on what the government calls a responsible budget that is right for the times. Now the Coalition has its right of reply to tell us how it sees this first Labor budget in 9 years. And welcome to you all, and welcome to Coalition MPs past and present and members of the Coalition front bench. Angus Taylor comes to the podium today after several addresses here at the National Press Club in the past in his previous role as Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions in the previous government. He also comes to the podium with a background in economics and the law and business. As some of you know, he was raised on a sheep farm in southern New South Wales and graduated from the University of Sydney in law and economics, and that includes getting the medal in economics at the university. He was a Rhodes Scholar, attended the University of Oxford, and I think one thing that we all need to know is that one thing he studied was the protection of the English pub against the big breweries in England. I think as an economic policy, the support of the neighbourhood pub is something we can all agree with. You can follow the conversation today on Twitter at Press Club Aust or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Angus Taylor.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Morris, for having me here at the Press Club today. Can I acknowledge a number of my shadow ministerial colleagues who are here today? Senator Perrin Davey and Anne Ruston, Paul Fletcher is here as well. Strong representation from our economic team here today with Senators Jane Hume, Michaelia Cash and Dean Smith as well. And I'd like to acknowledge a number of the Canberra Liberals here today, and in particular Elizabeth Lee and Jeremy Hanson. Great to have you here today. Just a few weeks before the budget, I spent 8 days travelling around 1,000 kilometres on a bike for this year's Polypedal, riding through New South Wales, through the southwest slopes, and with the canola, the wheat, the wine, the sheep that fuel our exports. I had the opportunity and privilege to meet with and listen to Australians at the front line of our economy. Economics is often conflated with statistics, forecasts and government accounts. But ultimately, economics is about people. And the people I met on that trip are under pressure. Business is good, but they can't find staff. They're getting more hours for work, but their groceries are costing more. They're proud to have saved for their first home, but their mortgage payments keep going up. The main street is booming, but the roads into town need more investment after several wet years. And whether a small business, a manufacturer or a household, power bills are beginning to eat into their pockets and they're worried that it's going to get worse. At the Cowra Neighbourhood and Information Centre, a not-for-profit which provides help for those doing it tough, the CEO, Fran Steed, told me that the demand for their services has never been so high. More than 60 people are coming in every day, many who have jobs and a mortgage but are simply struggling to make ends meet. They're asking for help for everyday staples like milk and bread. People who have never had to ask for help before and have always been too proud to do so, but now they simply have no choice. These people might not get profiled in the weekend papers or be subject to glossy photo shoots, but these are the people that the budget is really about. And the budget was silent on how to help them. Now, the people I've spoken about are real-world examples of the economic dilemma presented by inflation. The economy is, at a macro level, in a very strong position. The Australian economy is fundamentally resilient. Just 2 years ago, we were staring down the prospect of permanent business closures, tens of thousands of deaths, and an unemployment rate of 15%. Today, we have more businesses, strong terms of trade, record commodity prices, economic growth over 3%, and record low unemployment. Now, not every decision during COVID was perfect, but Australia's economic recovery is a testament to the Coalition's economic management. The Coalition left Labor with a strong economy, a rapidly improving budget position in far better shape than most thought was possible even a short time ago. Our March budget saw a $103 billion turnaround, the largest since Federation. The final budget outcome for our last year in office, our last full year in office, saw $47.9 billion improvement in the underlying cash balance from the budget forecasts back in March. The trajectory continued in last year's budget, in the updated forecast for last week's budget, in the updated forecast for 2022-23. But despite this turnaround and despite this economic strength, people aren't feeling it in their everyday lives. The pressure of inflation on household budgets is eating away those national gains. And a budget that fails to treat the inflation problem at its source is a budget that fails to support Australians through symptoms of these cost of living pressures. The best way a government can put downward pressure on inflation is through a clear and comprehensive plan with a sound budget at its core. Now, no government can control all the circumstances and the context it faces. Of course it can't. In government, we had plenty of challenges coming our way. But what the government can and must control, though, is the response to these challenges. The budget handed down by the Treasurer last week was an opportunity to start outlining his plan to deal with the challenges in the economy. The test for the budget was simple: to deliver a comprehensive plan to consolidate the strong economic and budget position inherited from the Coalition, to put downward pressure on inflation and interest rates without increasing taxes, to relieve supply-side pressures in the economy by increasing productivity and participation, and to deliver key promises Labor made to the Australian people at the election. The government had the opportunity to deliver a budget that outlined a shorter-term plan to reach or even approach budget balance, containing interest rates and inflation in the process. It had the opportunity to map a longer-term plan to empower aspiration and enterprise, reasserting the role of productivity and lower taxes in driving growth and real wages. We said we would work with Labor if it stayed true to these common sense principles, and we will. We've been upfront on the measures that we support in the budget. As Peter Dutton outlined in his budget in reply speech, we'll support a number of measures such as the extension of the childcare subsidy, the increased flexibility of paid parental leave, measures to reduce the pharmaceutical benefits scheme co-payment, and sensible approaches to ensuring the NDIS is sustainable. From early on in my role as Shadow Treasurer, I've made a point of laying out the principles we will use to evaluate policy, giving the government the opportunity to look for areas of bipartisanship. But overwhelmingly, the budget was a missed opportunity. This is ultimately a high-taxing, high-spending, traditional Labor budget. The Prime Minister and Treasurer are out today saying it could have been worse. Perhaps any budget could be worse. This is hardly a glowing self-evaluation. But my point is that it could have been a lot better. For a start, what we needed in this budget was recognition that economic growth over the medium term has to be stronger than spending growth. Economic growth stronger than spending growth. That's what we did in government between 2013 through to the pandemic. It's achievable, but it's hard and it requires enormous discipline. Instead of a comprehensive plan to consolidate the strong economic and budget position, we have growing deficits and no medium-term fiscal strategy for balanced budgets. Instead of delivering economic growth stronger than spending growth, we have $142 billion of extra taxes and likely more to come. And instead of a productivity agenda, we have union red tape, more big government and cuts to employment, innovation and small business programs. And in terms of broken promises, there are many. $275 reduction in power prices, gone. No changes in franking credits? Gone. Real wage increases in this term of government? Gone. But the biggest broken promise is the one the Prime Minister made before the election. The promise that no one would be held back, and no one would be left behind. This is a budget that tells Australians the government knows that it's tough but doesn't have the solutions. It's a budget that tells older and younger Australians wanting to work more that this government will hold them back. And it's a budget that tells Australians pain is coming and leaves them on their own to deal with it. Even on Labor's own tests, it fails. Before the budget, the Treasurer spoke a lot about managing debt and deficits, yet his own budget papers show the policies of his government will see increasing deficits, not narrowing ones, and therefore increasing debt. Now, the biggest missed opportunity is that Labor's budget does little to address the root cause of inflation. To help Australians facing rising prices, we need to tackle the source, not just the symptoms of cost of living pressures. The budget fails to use fiscal policy to make any headway to reduce pressures on inflation, to address the source of the pressure. This is something that central bankers around the world, including the Reserve Bank, have been calling for. Instead, the budget raises the white flag when it comes to inflation. A more than 50% increases in power prices over the next 2 years, 56%, rising inflation, rising unemployment, slower economic growth, and as I said earlier, no real wage growth in this term of Parliament. Just after the budget was released, we've seen annual inflation hit 7.3%, the highest level in more than 3 decades. And we've seen the Reserve Bank, the ANZ Bank, the Commonwealth and others now forecast end-of-year inflation to be higher than what was contained in the budget. Now, the important point here is that the budget doesn't make the Reserve Bank's job any easier to contain inflation. Stephen Koukoulas, former economist to Julia Gillard, has said that the budget puts no downward pressure on inflation, leaving, and I quote, the RBA with all of the work carrying the can in getting the inflation rate lower. All of the work in carrying the can. This sentiment has been echoed by a range of economists. Yesterday, we saw the RBA raise interest rates for a 7th consecutive month. This means that a family with a $750,000 mortgage is now paying more than $1,200 extra per month on their repayments compared with May of this year. Concerns expressed by some economists and commentators shouldn't be a surprise. The government's spending an extra $114 billion in the budget compared with March, and on policy decisions alone, it's added more than $23 billion in spending. Across the forward estimates, the government's clocking up deficits to the tune of $181.8 billion. Deficits are now forecast to grow higher over that period, rising from $32 billion in the 21-22 final budget outcome to $51.3 billion in 24-25. Deficits going up over that time period. And spending growth over the forward estimates is forecast to exceed economic growth. The long-term trend and the long-term signal is that fiscal policy is going to continue to expand at a time when the economy is already running hot. But what's most alarming is that the government's own fiscal strategy actually abandons the goal to return the budget to balance. It abandons that goal. In March, the Coalition's fiscal strategy emphasised the need to reduce gross and net debt, cap tax at 23.9% of GDP, and to return the budget to balance. Indeed, every budget since 1996 has emphasised the need to run budget surpluses or get to balance over the medium term. Last week, the Labor government's fiscal strategy abandoned any reference to balancing the budget or capping taxes, completely abandoned. This makes Jim Chalmers the first Treasurer since the Charter of Budget Honesty came into effect to abandon the goal of balancing the budget. Professor Stephen Hamilton from the ANU's Tax and Transfer Policy Unit has said this budget delivers, and I quote, the weakest economic and fiscal strategy of any government since the Charter of Budget Honesty was established, and the exact opposite approach of a responsible economic manager. Hamilton also notes that the government is actively driving the budget deeper into structural deficit. By failing to adopt responsible fiscal policy, the government has abandoned its role in supporting the RBA to reduce inflationary pressures. But we see this refusal to acknowledge the impact that government can have extend beyond fiscal strategy and in a number of the broader choices it made in the budget. Before the budget, the Coalition called on the government to adopt policies that in the medium term grow the economy faster than spending with pro-growth policies that support innovation, enterprise and reduce red tape. Instead, it's decided some of its first targets for cuts are programs that support business innovation, that support work experience, that get young Australians into jobs and help small businesses reduce their power bills. The cost of these programs are modest, but instead we're seeing the money funnelled away from supporting the economy into the public sector and the union movement. Tens of millions to the public service, 20,000 new public servants, 6.1 million in grants to the CFMEU to audit our textile industry, and tens of millions to develop and enforce workplace laws that will mean any business with more than 15 employees will be subject to industry-wide bargaining and strikes. All the while, the pension work policy proposed by the Coalition has been watered down by the government. The Treasury is happy to use super to pursue a range of social causes, but not to support choice for young Australians and older women trying to buy a home. And regional infrastructure, a vital enabler of productivity and growth, has been rated to fund other priorities that seem to be conspicuously aligned with the electoral prospects of the Victorian Labor Party. By pursuing these priorities, the government has failed this test. The consequence is a budget that offers little to relieve small businesses, to find more staff and relieve supply constraints, and this will make many of those pressures worse in the medium term. But the choices in the budget on infrastructure, on industrial relations and on tax set Australia up for less growth, less productivity, higher costs and fewer jobs. Infrastructure investment drives economic growth. It creates jobs, encourages investment, boosts productivity, busts congestion and supports resilient supply chains. In government, we backed local communities with a range of long-term infrastructure projects that meet the challenges they face. But a Prime Minister who regularly talks up his infrastructure credentials has decided to cut $2.8 billion of infrastructure projects and delay a further $6.5 billion in infrastructure projects in the budget. Now, I've seen firsthand in recent weeks how much these projects mean to regional communities whose roads need investment and growing populations, particularly post-COVID. We've seen extraordinary resilience in regional areas. Those growing populations need infrastructure support. These projects are game changers that, as I said, bust congestion, build capacity and most importantly, improve quality of life. Infrastructure Minister Catherine King claimed there will be transparency on decision making in her portfolio, but communities across Australia are scrambling to find out what has happened to their local projects. At the same time, it's put $2.2 billion behind the suburban rail loop, a project that hasn't been recommended by Infrastructure Australia and that the Victorian Auditor General found has a cost-benefit ratio of just 56 cents in the dollar. Meanwhile, New South Wales, the Prime Minister's home state, my home state, our largest state, is receiving less in funding than Victoria, Queensland or the Northern Territory. This is a telling statement about the government's priorities. It's a blatantly political set of decisions, a government which is abandoning our regions to reward its supporters, and we'll see more of this approach when it comes to industrial relations. The government's trying to use the cover of the federal budget to introduce its extreme industrial relations reforms. Now, we all want to see higher real wages. Absolutely we do. But the government is seeking to hide behind this noble aim, and a noble aim it is, to implement one of the biggest re-regulations of the labour market in decades. They're doing this against business wishes, against small business wishes, and despite promises to work with business before the election. These changes will lead to more strikes and job losses, allow unions into small businesses, businesses that have never had to deal with them before, unions before, and businesses that are easily targeted because they don't have HR departments and they lack the resources to negotiate complicated, expensive changes. The changes will undermine competition, so Australians have fewer choices and face higher cost of living and costs of doing business. The productivity hit of these changes comes on top of the costs of repealing the construction watchdog. The ABCC is essential to ensure a fair playing field for a productive construction sector. For more than 445,000 small businesses in the construction sector, the certainty that they can run their businesses without standover tactics or intimidation is gone. Independent modelling earlier this year found that the abolition of the ACCC could lead to more than $47 billion in lost productivity. It's just another example of the Labor Party prioritising payback to their masters over the national interest. Now, there is no greater marker of values in this term of Parliament than what will happen with taxes. Delivering the Stage 3 tax cuts was an ironclad promise at the election from Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese, and they are legislated. Any move to walk away from them would be a broken promise of incredible magnitude. The budget already increases tax revenues by $142 billion compared with March. That's over $12,000 for a typical family. Inflation will drive income tax receipts up by a percentage point of GDP before the Stage 3 tax cuts come into effect. This is the insidious work of that thief in the night bracket creep. It's a tax on the hard work and savings of the Australian people as more income goes into higher tax brackets. It disincentivises people to work more and to work harder because it's ultimately their incomes that are swallowed up in higher taxes. Labor has abandoned the tax to GDP cap, despite having one when they were last in government, taking the guardrails off taxes and spending. The Stage 3 tax cuts mean the vast majority of Australian workers will keep at least 70 cents of every dollar, every extra dollar they earn. It sends a signal to Australians to get out there, build businesses, build careers, take risks and have a go. If they do, they can use a simple rule of thumb for the reward for effort. Between $45,000 and $200,000 in earnings, they will keep at least 70 cents in the dollar. It's very simple and very clear, and we think a huge motivator. It should concern all Australians that the Labor government has lost interest in this pledge and has a placeholder in the budget to water it down or get rid of it. We know from interviews with the Treasurer before the budget that this discussion, that Labor's discussion around Stage 3 tax cuts, is being led with the Prime Minister's support. And we've already seen in this budget the Prime Minister and Treasurer break their promise not to make changes to franking credits. Retirees and fund managers would have been surprised to find an unannounced $550 million tax grab on retirees and Australian investors in budget paper number 2, something never promised at the election and never floated with industry. It's clear that the Australian government has decided to pursue their 2019 tax reforms incrementally, but the destination is the same. Higher taxes, sapping aspiration, ruining confidence and dragging down the productive capabilities of the economy. Along with the government's approaches to industrial relations and infrastructure, this is not a medium-term solution for economic growth. Now, the solutions to the economic challenges we're now facing are not unknown. We've faced similar challenges in the past. In the short term, it's crucial to address the supply-side challenges that drive inflation, and it's crucial to embrace prudent fiscal management. In the medium term, it's critical to grow the economy faster than spending to return the budget to balance. So rather than embracing that back-to-basics economic agenda, this budget is full of missed opportunities. It's a budget that confirms that the price of everything is going up except real wages, and it's a missed opportunity to build on the improving budget position left by the coalition. A missed opportunity to put in place a prudent budget strategy that will put downward pressure on inflation, benefiting all Australians. I began this speech by making the point that the economy and budgets are fundamentally about people. Everyday Australians are going about their lives and doing their best to make ends meet. Just before the election, the Prime Minister told Australians that they will be better off under a Labor government. But the unfortunate reality is that by Christmas, the typical Australian family will be at least $2,000 worse off. These Australians will be making tough decisions this Christmas because of a government that doesn't have a plan. Now, every nation is facing challenges born from the pandemic and amplified by global economic headwinds. It's true everywhere. But we approach these challenges here in Australia in a stronger position than almost any other nation in the world. And I noticed the RBA Governor making this point in his speech last night. If the government embraces sensible and pragmatic policies that deal with inflationary pressures and set up Australia for growth, we will back them. We will back them. But if it continues to raise taxes, raise deficits and break promises, we will hold them to account. Australia deserves no less.
Thank you very much for that address. We have a dozen journalists ready to go, but I'll open the questioning with one about the, I guess, one of the core issues that you've addressed in your speech, which is the need to address inflation at its source. And I think it's only reasonable to point out that in your speech you didn't mention some of those sources. For instance, the war in Ukraine, gas prices up around the world, OPEC cutting output of oil and therefore pushing up prices, central banks arguably too slow to prepare for that inflation rise that we've seen around the world, not just in Australia. And I think as a fifth factor, should I mention $8.6 billion in spending in the coalition budget in March on things like tax offsets and household assistance, which could have added to prices. So isn't it a little bit unfair to expect a single budget from a new government to stop all of that at once?
Yeah, look, I did make the point, David, and I made this several times in the speech, and I was very conscious of making this point, that we're facing real challenges here in Australia, as every government is around the world, and we haven't seen inflationary pressures like this for a long, long time. And there's many Australians who haven't seen it before. So we're very cognizant of that. But the nature of government is not whether you can avoid some of those headwinds. You get headwinds in government. It's how you respond to them. And what surprised me most about this budget is that you haven't got a budget with reducing deficits. You've got one with increasing deficits. It's a long while since we've had a treasurer say, actually, I'm going to make the deficits worse over the coming few years. Now, in an inflationary environment, that's the exact opposite of what you need to do. And the point here is not that it's an easy environment. We haven't had an easy environment in this country for a number of years. We dealt with a very difficult environment in that last couple of years in government. The point here is that there's no comprehensive plan to deal with it. Almost to the point where the Treasurer is much more comfortable giving forecasts, making commentary, mostly about doom and gloom, rather than telling us what the plan is. And that's the missed opportunity. It's the missed opportunity to respond to the challenges, not to prevent them. No one can. They're real.
Our next question is from Katina Curtis.
Thanks. Katina Curtis from the West Australian. You have laid out, I guess, a lot of the problems and the structural deficit. Do you think that structural deficit can really be fixed only through spending cuts? Where on those really high growing spending areas, NDIS, health, aged care, defence, where would you put the cuts, and what constructive suggestions might you make on the revenue side?
Yeah, look, the first and most important point I would make is that what we achieved between 2013 and the pandemic, which was to get the budget back into balance, the key to that was to make sure that growth in the economy was stronger than spending growth. It's a really simple equation. It's a very simple equation. It's hard to do, but it doesn't mean, mad cuts. It does mean just sensible management of the economy and real discipline. I mean, I sat around the table for many of the decisions we made in my portfolios from the time when I was a minister, and there was a real discipline about that decision making. Obviously things changed when the pandemic happened, they had to, but right up until that point, there was that kind of discipline, and that's what's needed. I don't see that. They're not even trying. I mean, what was so remarkable about this policy document is that the fiscal strategy didn't include in it getting back to budget balance, even a pathway to budget balance. It was gone. It's taken out. So this is giving up the ghost. It really is putting up the white flag on the fundamental issues. Now, we've laid out a number of ways that we think we can get the economy growing faster, one of which is through the stage 3 tax cuts, a number of the other areas that I've talked about Today, I've talked about making sure we get as many people into work as we can, particularly in the next couple of years. Pensioners, I mean, there's a ready-made workforce out there who want to work more, but they lose their pensions if they do it. So doubling the work bonus is a simple way to do that. Labor went with a half-baked version of it. So we've, as an opposition, for this stage in the term of Parliament, laid out a lot, both in terms of principle and specifics. We'll lay out more in the coming months and years as well. But the principles are really important because they're principles that have worked in the past and can work again in the future.
Our next question is from Phil Curry.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, Mr Taylor. Phil Corey from the AFR. On the Stage 3 tax cuts, last week when the budget forecast inflation to fall from its current heights to back to 2.5 by 24-25, which is within the RBA's target band, you said words to the effect that's one less excuse Labor has for tampering with those cuts because it won't be an inflationary environment. Yesterday, the RBA upped that forecast again to just over 3 for calendar year 24-25. So, sorry, for calendar year 24. So do you need to be more judicious at this stage in your commitment to those Stage 3 tax cuts? You know, would you be prepared, I guess, to change your mind if the inflation rate was above the band at the time of their implementation and you'd either need to delay them or pare them back?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Phil. Look, you've got to remember that both sides of politics went to the last election with an ironclad promise, no asterisks, no footnotes, to support the Stage 3 tax cuts. There was no ambiguity about this. And further than that, they're in legislation. So to move away from them now, I think, is just completely unacceptable. More than that, I think as we come out of the current challenges we're facing today, there is a consensus across economists that we'll move back to the RBA target range within the next couple of years. We can split hairs over 6 months, but there is a consensus across economists that that's what's going to happen. And what we need then is a fast-growing economy where people are getting out, investing, building careers, building businesses, having a crack, taking risks, because we know that's the only way to drive productivity and investment and drive growth. And the best way to do that is to say to them, it's a really simple equation for you. If your income is anywhere south of $200,000, you're going to keep at least 70 cents in the dollar in your pocket. I can't think of a simpler, clearer message to Australians to get out there and build the productive capacity of this economy. That's what we need, Phil. And I think, you know, splitting hairs about timing when that's what we need is the wrong debate to be having.
Thanks.
Next question is from Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News. Mr Taylor, back in 2020, before the war in Ukraine had escalated, there was a lot of pressure on your government to reserve gas exports on the east coast for the domestic market and very dire warnings about what was to come. Why didn't your government safeguard domestic supply and price in a better way? And what do you say and what do you acknowledge about the role that your government has played in the lead up to the place we find ourselves in now?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Anna. Look, the point I always made as Energy Minister and that we pursued most of all in the time we were in government is that you've got to drive supply. Supply of gas, supply of dispatchable generation, as well as the record levels of investment you're seeing in renewables in electricity. And it worked. It worked. We did see gas prices that hovered up towards $20 a gigajoule back about 6 years ago. And we got the gas producers together and we said, we need more gas in the domestic network. And we got it. And we got prices down from that approaching $20 down to more like $5 in our last full year, $5 or $6 or $7 a gigajoule. I mean, dramatic reductions from where they were at. And the key to that was supply. Now, you cannot get supply from the gas producers if you demonise them. You just can't. I mean, asking a business to help you when you're demonising them, it simply doesn't work. And yet that's the position the Labor government is now in. You've got senior ministers who've been calling gas BS and a fraud, and then they're asking the gas producers to work with them They've got this the wrong way around. Supply is the answer. Rod Sims put it very well in the last little while, where he said, you just got to get more supply in the domestic network and you'll get those prices down. We've seen it in Australia, it's worked, we know it worked. We've seen it in the US, by the way, as well. Exactly the same. You can separate that domestic price from the international price, but it's all about supply. You've got to help them get more gas out from under the ground and then more gas into the domestic network. That's what we did as a government, and it worked.
So no responsibility then?
Well, we got it to work. And I've made the point time and time again to Labor, this is what they should do. We'll see if they do it. But supply is always going to be the answer.
A follow-up to that question, because energy is such a big part of the debate at the moment, and it was your previous portfolio, one of the key claims being made is that the previous government delayed the release of electricity price updates by the Australian Energy Regulator. Did you sign that regulation that postponed that price disclosure to Australians?
So David, this is a government that has an excuse for everything and a plan for nothing. That's one of a long list of excuses they're making for why there's going to be a 56% increase in electricity prices and a 44% increase in gas prices. They seem to be arguing that I had some kind of crystal ball that could see how badly they were going to manage energy policy and that I should have given them the crystal ball. And the truth is they've completely mismanaged it. And that was a report from the Australian Energy Regulator that was issued at a time recommended by the Industry Department and strongly supported by the regulator and stakeholders to align the timing with the issue of the poles and wires costings. So, you know, Labor's argument on this is spurious. I would also make the point there was a draft report put out earlier in the year that Labor completely ignored. So this is just a pathetic excuse.
But does that mean that you actually did sign the regulation, that the effect of it was to delay the release of that pricing information?
I did as was recommended by the Industry Department and by the regulator. So it's what they wanted. And the truth of the matter is, the other point I'd make is that the 56% price increase that's happening now, I mean, this is way beyond anything that was even contemplated.
But now the first year of that, though, is, I think, 20% on electricity. So that's already baked in because it was baked in under the previous government. Is that right? So you can't really blame Labor for that 20% increase in the immediate year since it was happening under your government.
Well, as I'll say again, I mean, Labor put out modelling back earlier, it was about 6 months before the election, back in November in 2021. That modelling at the time I said was wrong. I gave them lots of warning about this. I said it's wrong. I said their investment, massive investment, up to $80 billion of total investment in poles and wires is going to drive up the price of electricity. Their broader policies on generation are not going to get the $275 price increase. I don't know how many more warnings I could have given Labor that they're not going to achieve their policies, and they're not. They're simply not, David. Now, they'll look for an excuse for everything. That's what they're doing at the moment. They were, I remind you, very resolute on the idea that government should take responsibility. And they've got an opportunity to do it now. They haven't done it yet.
Next question from Andrew Probyn.
Mrs. Taylor, it does sound like you did actually deliberately keep it secret. But my question is about absolute truth in politics. You know, it's aside from cheap gas, absolute truth is perhaps the second rarest. We have those little golden moments, election night, you know, whether it be usually the defeated, or we had a cracker in 2015 with the valedictory speech. Joe Hockey used his valedictory speech to say that he thought that we should raise the GST, that we should pare back superannuation tax concessions and crack down on negative gearing and skew it towards new housing. Do any of those approaches or ideas have any appeal to you, or do we have to wait until your valedictory speech?
Well, look,
we're playing cricket on the weekend, so I mean, this is an early bouncer.
Yeah, look, Andrew, can I say that right now Labor's into flying a lot of kites. And
this is Joe Hockey flying the kites, though, 2015.
But right now we've got Labor flying a lot of kites. I'm not going to go flying kites. When we announce our positions in the lead up to the next election, we'll make it very clear. But I've laid out today a whole series of principles about how we're thinking about policy, the sort of policies we're looking at. And we've made a number of policy announcements in recent weeks, and we'll continue to do that. But we're not going to do what the Labor government's doing at the moment, which is to continually put up these. One of the most recent kites is that getting rid of the stage 3 tax cuts. They're all talking about every kind of tax. Superannuation, I think, is out there at the moment. We're just not going to go down that path.
Next question is from Patrick Commons.
Thanks very much, Mr Taylor. I have a question going back to gas again. You spoke about how the budget was a missed opportunity to address the sources of inflation, how supply of gas is the key to getting prices down. And in that context, New South Wales Liberal Treasurer Matt Keane has called for a national gas and coal reservation, and he's demanded that WA send some of their gas over to the East Coast to bring down gas prices. So do you support that proposal?
Well, I support getting more gas out and into the domestic network, Pat. That's what we want to see, including from New South Wales. I was the strongest supporter of the Narrabri project. I've been talking about the importance of getting more supply out and into the domestic network for a number of years. It hasn't always been popular, but it's, in my view, always been right. And it's what we need right now. It's what the world needs right now. The world has discovered through the process of what's happened in Europe just what an important fuel source gas is to ensure that we can balance that record level of investment we're seeing in renewables and will continue to see, and make sure we've got the dispatchable capacity we need, as well as the industrial fuel sources and sources for fertiliser and so on. So it's got a hugely important role to play, and it means we've got to get it out from under the ground, including at Narrabri in New South Wales. I've been arguing for, what's it now, about 12 or 13 years that Victoria should raise its moratorium. Before politics, I did a report with Peter Reith arguing this. So I've been very consistent on it, far more consistent, I would argue, than most. We're seeing now the consequences of governments where they've failed to get that right. Now there's an opportunity to get it right. So I think every government needs to have a look at the opportunities to get it right.
And sorry, do you support Matt Keane's proposal? Well,
I support getting more gas out from under the ground into our domestic network. Now, whether transporting it across from WA is the best way to do it, I mean, that's something that no doubt there'll be lots of debate over. But we've just got to get it out from under the ground. And frankly, New South Wales and Victoria would be good places to start to get more out, because that's where it's needed and that's where we know we have the biggest supply gaps.
So a follow-up on that question is, whose fault is it that Narrabri isn't producing gas now? There's been a decade, or 9 years of coalition power in Canberra and a decade of coalition power in New South Wales.
Yep.
So whose fault is it that Narrabri is not producing?
Well, I said earlier, David, that in response to your earlier question, that the job of government is to respond to the challenges they have. When I was Energy Minister, I did an energy deal with New South Wales, which asked for an extra 90 petajoules of gas, and it was delivered through approval of Narrabri. Now they've got to actually turn that approval into an operating project. I think everyone sees now the importance of doing that, and I'll look forward to the New South Wales government doing exactly that.
Next question from Shane Wright.
Thank you, Mr Crowe. Mr Taylor, Shane Wright from the SMH and the Age. The most important financial institution in the country, the Reserve Bank, is undergoing a review that both sides went to the last election promising to put in place. Yep. Last week, the Commonwealth Bank, the nation's biggest leader, released its submission into the review and said the current structure of the RBA board is not compatible with generally accepted best practice for boards in Australia. At the moment, the board is created by the Treasurer. Every member of the board is a current appointee of either Scott Morrison or Josh Frydenberg. What is your view on the structure of the Reserve Bank board? Should it change? And do you think it's failed over the last 3 to 4 years in dealing with the economic challenges facing the country?
Yeah, they're all good questions, and they're the sorts of questions that are the reason why we support the review going ahead, Shane. You know my view is that we need a credible, capable central bank that is independent, and it should stay that way, and our view is that it should have strong inflation targeting right at the heart of its goals. And there should be no shift away from that. We are open to shifts that deliver on that strategy, those goals. Is governance an area where there can be improvement? We're open to consideration of that. I'm not going to speculate at this point until we've actually seen at least a draft of the review. But we want to work in a bipartisan way with the government. I've spoken to Jim Chalmers directly about the importance of this review and our willingness to work with them on it to get a good outcome. I mean, you know, there will always be criticism of central banks, and it's true they've got their forecasts. They got their forecasts wrong. There's no doubt about that, and they got their guidance wrong. And part of the review should be looking at why and how to prevent that in the future. I think that's a very important part of the work.
But does that start at the board?
Well, look, again, that's exactly what the review needs to be looking at. Is the governance right? It's a good question. Let's make sure we get it right. And we will be open to looking at options available to improve the performance of the RBA. I don't think anyone, including the RBA itself, thinks that they've got everything right over the last few years. I mean, the Governor himself has made that point. And so can we do better? I'm sure we can, or the Reserve Bank can. What do we have to do to help to facilitate that? That's what the review's all about.
The next question is from Poppy Johnson.
Poppy Johnson from AAP. You've called on the government to put together a plan to tackle cost of living pressures, and one of your key suggestions has been to allow pensioners to work more hours without losing their payments. Just wondering if there's anything else concrete you would like to see from the government on cost of living.
Yeah, so that is a very clear way you can get both a way to deal with the cost of living pressures that are faced by pensioners, of course, and deal with the supply side pressures in the economy, shortage of labour. But the other point I made, and I made this a number of times during my speech, is that we need prudent fiscal management, a prudent approach to budgeting. The core of that is having fiscal rules that you drive right down to ERC. Now, every ERC meeting should be one where everyone understands the fiscal rule, which is to get the budget back into balance, and to make sure that you've got an economy growing faster than you're spending. I mean, households do this every day, businesses do this every day, governments can do it too. It's a very simple approach. It's one it's not as though this is theoretical, we did it between 2013 with lots of headwinds and lots of challenges, there were no shortage of those, through to the pandemic. Now, you know, there's a number of areas where we suspect we can work with the government, and we want the NDIS to be sustainable. We've said that. Peter Dutton said in his budget and reply speech, this is an important area for us to ensure there is sustainability, because this is a program we must ensure succeeds. We've also made the point that we think that $20 billion of investment in poles and wires in projects that have not been recommended by the market operator is not necessary. So there's a number of areas we've already pointed out, and we'll continue to do exactly that. But most importantly, we've laid out the principles, and that's what I've talked about in the speech.
The next question is from Ashley Wick.
Ashley Wick from 9 News. Mr Taylor, what would be your plan to get wages moving now?
So the single most important thing we can do to get wages moving is continue to have a strong economy and ensure that we've got the sort of productivity outcomes that we need, that we know historically over a long period of time, the Productivity Commission tells us this all the time, have driven wages. But the other way to put more money in people's pockets is to have lower taxes. And, you know, that it's after-tax income that people are interested in. That's what you take home, that's what you spend, that's what you save, that's what you use to buy a house, to pay for your kids' education, whatever it is you want to do with it. And it's that after-tax income that really counts. And that's why we firmly believe that now is the right time to be pursuing and putting in place the stage 3 tax cuts, making sure Australians know up to $200,000 they're getting up to 70 cents or more than 70 cents in the dollar, at least. That certainty that we can give them is so important, and that gives them the after-tax real wage increase that we want to see, alongside what we think the market can deliver if we continue to drive those long-term policies that give us the economic growth we all want to see.
Thanks.
The next question is from Ben Westcott.
Hello, Shadow Treasurer. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you for your speech. One thing you've mentioned a lot during the speech was the need for more supply of gas, and in response to questions here. But the final version of the final edition, of government figures at the end of your time as Energy Minister showed gas production stalling over coming years. why didn't you put more gas supply into the system to avert a crisis like this? And is it fair to criticise the Labor government when your government couldn't do it?
Well, those forecasts had been, which are put out by on a regular basis, I think every year at least, every 6 months, that give those updates, had been showing for years that there were shortages, and for years we'd managed to deliver. Now, the point about this is that this isn't set and forget. You've got to stay right on it. And I saw this time and time again. That's why I did a deal with the New South Wales government to get the 90 petajoules of gas going into the system. That's why we put in place a number of initiatives that would help gas get to market through the pipeline capacity we need. That's why we had a focus on getting more gas storages in place. A number of those initiatives have been taken away by the Labor government. And they are initiatives that we pursued for many years. So this is something that no government is ever going to find easy, but can be done. And the truth is we did do it. And that's why you did see that significant reduction in gas prices. But there is no doubt that if you let your foot off the accelerator on this one, you're going to see shortages. And the shortages won't just have an impact on gas prices, they'll have an impact on electricity prices.
Sorry, you said you did do it, but according to these government figures, the gas production had stalled, so essentially you didn't do it. I mean, how can you criticise the Labor government when these figures show a stalling in gas production?
Well, they were forecasts you were talking about. Yes. I'm talking about the actuals, what actually was delivered. What that gave us is a warning that we needed to keep the foot on the accelerator. And so we kept the foot on the accelerator. I tell you what we didn't do is demonise the gas industry. You can't ask an industry to do what you need it to do and then demonise it in the same sentence. But that's what we're seeing from the Labor government. Enormous division within their ranks about this, by the way, and that's part of the problem. You've got to give confidence to investors, to business owners, that you can work with them, you see them as part of the solution and not part of the problem, and that's what we did. And that's why we did deliver on those outcomes that I described earlier on.
Thank you.
Next question is from Paul Karp.
Paul Karp from Guardian Australia. Thanks very much, Mr Taylor. You said gas prices are all about supply, but actually increasing gas production does very little to decrease the price when it's mostly exported. And Labor's heads of agreement has increased domestic supply and prices are still too high. So my question, please, is would the Coalition support a mandatory code of conduct, including regulation of price? And secondly, if you want to pay down debt and deficit, would you support an increase in the PRRT?
So Paul, on your point about supply, we did see what happens when you get more supply into the gas network. We saw the gas price drop to $5 a gigajoule. I mean, the key to this is very simple. There's only so much gas that can be exported from Australia. It's the same in the United States. We're two of the biggest exporters alongside Qatar in the world. And there's only so much you can export. So if you can produce more than that, and more than the domestic market needs, you drive down the price. And that's what we've seen in the United States. Henry Hub price has reflected that. The US government, Democrat, obviously, administration, has supported making sure more supply comes out from under the ground, and we did exactly the same. And we saw the results of that. So that's, the proof is in the pudding. And, you can see this by just looking at what Rod Sims says, who's watched this market for a long while, reported on this market, reviewed this market in the past, and he's made exactly the same point. So I think it's very clear. You ask a question about more tax. I mean, our focus is to get the price down, not to tax more. I mean, the primary goal here right now has to be to get the price down, and the key to that, it's economics 101. If you want to get the price down, get more supply in. That's how markets work.
I heard your point about the premise on exporting gas, but I didn't hear an answer on supporting a mandatory code of conduct regulating price.
Yeah. So we supported the voluntary code of conduct that's already in place. And we'll, at this point, I don't know what's being proposed. It's just too hard to speculate. So we'll see what comes forward. But, there's no question that the government needs to work closely with the gas producers, stop demonising them, work with them and find solutions with them. Is taking the code of conduct to the next step part of that? Well, we'll wait and see, but at this point we haven't seen anything tangible to comment on.
So the word mandatory isn't necessarily a no-go for you?
Yeah, it's all about supply, David, and the key is to get more supply in. I think that can be done in a voluntary way if you do it the right way. But Labor's clearly already making a lot of mistakes on this, so let's see what the... I can't speculate at this point on something that's... It doesn't exist. This is the point. We've got a government that's in flying kites every day. Andrew asked me to fly a few kites a moment ago. There's enough being flown, you know. I don't want a kite, I want a plan. And sadly, I'm not going to look at another kite, which I noticed the Treasurer has just flown in the last few days. I mean, how many more will we see before we actually see a plan?
Next question is from Jacob Grieber.
Thanks, David. Jacob Grieber from the Australian Financial Review. So you've talked about the need to get more supply into the market. You've talked about the problems of people who are demonising the gas industry. Last week, Monique Ryan stood up in Parliament and asked a question of the government, which complained that money going to Middle Arm in Darwin Harbour was a subsidy to the gas industry, Beetaloo in particular. What's your message from the Liberal Party to the voters in those seats which we now call teal seats? Did they get it wrong?
Oh, that's not what I'm saying at all. I mean, the voters always get it right. That's the nature of... We live in a democracy, Jacob, and long may it stay that way. You know, it's a good thing. It's not you or me who decides who's in government. It's the Australian people, although we have 2 votes. They're not going to be overly influential. And that's a great thing, and long may it stay that way. Your question, though, goes to you know, the seats we lost and some of the issues of concern there. Look, I think it's completely consistent with bringing emissions down to have a strong gas industry in the coming years. I think that's the only way we're going to get there, because you need to have that dispatchable capacity, you need fertiliser, you need that feedstock. If people know that they've got the affordable, reliable energy they want, they are much happier with the idea of emissions coming down. So, you know, I think these things are completely reconcilable, but you've got to be realistic, and you've got to understand that so many Australian livelihoods depend on having affordable, reliable energy, and we should never lose sight of that.
Next question is from Katina Curtis.
Hi, I'll try again on the structural deficit. Have you got any constructive suggestions on the revenue side of the equation?
Yep, the revenue side of the equation, have a strong economy. That is the key. And this is what we learnt in government from 2013 through to 2019. If you can just keep your economy strong and keep it at a point where you know the economy is growing faster than you're spending, your budget comes back into balance. It's just straight maths. And it's such a powerful force. But you're not going to do that with policies like driving a toxic industrial relations culture, with policies where you're raising taxes, not reducing them. I mean, if you get rid of the stage 3 tax cuts, that's not business as usual, that's taxes going up, particularly in an inflationary environment, because bracket creep, that thief in the night, will take its hold. So, you know, these are the sensible policies that will drive growth. At the same time, you've got to have the discipline that I talked about in answering those earlier questions.
So you don't accept, as the Treasurer said, that tax has to be part of the conversation?
Well, the Treasurer will always want tax to be part of the conversation, because for Labor, tax is always part of the conversation. I mean, they didn't learn their lesson from 2019. They're back wanting to tax franking credits again. They're flying kites on the stage 3 tax cuts. I mean, the thing about Labor is tax is the solution to everything. That's not where we come from. We want to see a strong economy that's growing fast, that enables us to pay for those services Australians want and deserve, and that means having pro-growth settings. And those pro-growth settings are going to become really important as we get through the more immediate challenges we have right now. And that's why we're going to stay very focused on dealing with those challenges. What was so remarkable about this budget is just how little it said about creating that longer-term pro-growth environment, because you've got to be setting up now. People make investments today for the future, and they're not going to do it if they don't have confidence in the government's growth settings. And that's why we think it's so important to lock down on these stage 3 tax cuts, lock down on policies that are going to give us a strong economy, and get on with it.
The next question is from Philip Curry.
Round 2.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, it's me again. Sorry. Just quickly, you mentioned in your speech the 23.9% tax cap which you used. in government and Labor hasn't adhered or hasn't committed to. Will that remain coalition policy going to the next election at that level?
Yeah, that's our policy. We haven't got any plan to change it. I mean, what we want to see, Phil, as I say, is an environment where Australians have confidence that governments are not going to be either quietly or more explicitly raising taxes on them. We want them to have the confidence when they're making an investment in themselves, in their careers or in a business that they own or run, that they're across a broad range of income brackets going to keep up to 70 cents in the dollar, or 70 cents in the dollar or more. Just that confidence is so important. It just gives them the surety that they can get on and do things and know that they're keeping more in their pocket. And I think it's a huge incentive. And not just an incentive to make a vanilla investment, but to take risks. I mean, you're not going to see a strong, robust, resilient economy in the coming years if Australians aren't prepared to take risks. When you start a business and build it up over time, you're taking a lot of risk. It can be really hard on you and your family. So you've got to know the rewards there. And we want to give Australians that certainty that they're going to get that reward. And that's why having that really explicit commitment is important.
Thanks.
So just to add a bit more to that, the 2026 forecast is for a deficit that's about 2% of GDP. Now, if none of the answer is on the tax side, that then surely says to Australians that 2% of GDP would have to be found on the spending side to get us back to some sort of balance, which means more spending cuts.
No, but you're missing the third piece, which is the growth side. And that's so important, David. If you look at the history of getting budgets back to balance, a strong economy is absolutely the key ingredient. It always has been and it always will be. So that's why it's so important. You see, if you've got a strong economy, you can reconcile the services Australians want, those strong services that Australians want, with being able to pay for them. And you know, the moment you stop having a focus on the longer-term growth of the economy, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And that's why I think it was so remarkable in this budget. There was just so little focus on that.
Next question is from Anna Henderson.
Anna, yeah.
Thank you. Can I get a clear comment from you, Shadow Treasurer, on the Indigenous Voice to Parliament proposal? In principle, what is your position on that proposal?
Well, I mean, again, a lot of kites being flown. We haven't seen the detail, and we've said we'll make a more detailed response to this when we see the detail, but we haven't seen that yet.
You've been in government for a long time and a minister now in the Shadow Cabinet. So in principle, do you support the idea of an Indigenous advisory body on matters that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia?
What this government seems to love doing is flying a kite and asking us to respond to it without having the detail.
I don't think this is a kite. They've started almost every speech saying that this is what they're
But the point
to.
is that we haven't got the detail. And so the detail matters. In anything like this, the detail really counts. And it's true in economic policy as with so many other policies. We want to see the detail and then we'll respond on the detail.
And the last question is from Andrew Probyn.
Mr Taylor, last Friday the energy regulator told energy ministers that if they were to intervene into the market, they had to do it pretty quickly by the end of November because prices would be locked in. Now, there's talk about a $10 price cap, but I'm informed that the New South Wales government would be very keen on black coal, which is critical to their energy supply, that black coal, which is about $600 a tonne, be capped at 70. What's your approach to both the cap on gas and the cap on black coal? This is no kite. It's been flown by your own side in politics. So let's have an answer.
Well, whoever's flying it, it's still a very speculative proposal. But what I will say, Andrew, I know you want me to respond on speculative proposals. What's far less speculative, by the way, is the capacity mechanism that we were working up when we were in government. Now, this is a mechanism to get more dispatchable into the electricity capacity into the electricity market that has worked across much of the world. It works in WA, so it's on our doorstep. We know this mechanism works, and yet we still haven't seen the new Labor federal government embrace it and drive it. It's a really simple, important reform. It obviously never going to be easy to get right. You've got to work through it. But there's a proposal that's out there that has been recommended by the ESB and others, and yet it's still not being embraced. Now, it defies gravity, if you like, to ignore the need to have more dispatchable capacity in the marketplace, and yet we're not seeing this being embraced. It's time to embrace it and get on with it. The proposal is there. And that's not a kite, that's a very specific proposal, Andrew.
Thank you very much. I think it's pretty clear that the questions about the budget, gas, electricity and power prices aren't going to end anytime soon, so we look forward to having you back in the future to talk about this. We also have your membership of the club here as a gift to thank you for being with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking Angus Taylor.